We're going to start on real time rather than Berkeley time. And I'm Jack Citrin. I'm the director of the Institute of Governmental Studies, which includes the Robert T. Matsui Center for Politics and Public Service, the organizer of tonight's event, which is actually the only event on campus, I believe, commemorating and thinking about 9/11 10 years later. We're truly honored that Chancellor Birgeneau and Mrs. Birgeneau are here to open this event. It's really something special that they've taken the time to come here. Before I introduce the Chancellor a little more formally, let me make a brief logistical announcement. I think people have been given index cards on which you may write questions for the panel. During this discussion, our moderator, Michael Krasny, who I think is a household name to most of us here in the Bay Area, will ask you to pass those cards to the end of the aisle, where they will be collected and taken up to Michael, and Michael will then pose some of the audience questions to the panel. Now, to make just a few introductory remarks, let me say a word or two about Chancellor Robert J. Birgeneau, Chancellor of the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Birgeneau became the 9th Chancellor of the University on September 22nd, 2004. We all know that he's an internationally distinguished physicist. He's a leader in higher education and is particularly well known for his commitment to diversity and equity in the academic community. On a personal note, I want to say he has been an extremely generous supporter of IGS and has made it possible for us to sustain the many programs that we have that try to introduce undergraduate students into public service programs. So thank you for that, Bob. Before coming to Berkeley, Chancellor Birgeneau served 4 years as president of the University of Toronto. He previously was dean of the School of Science at MIT, where he was on the faculty for 25 years. Among his many honors, he's a fellow of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Society of London, the American Philosophical Society, and other scholarly societies, and he has received many awards for his teaching and research, and he is a proponent of Go Bears when it comes to football and basketball season. So really, please join me in thanking Chancellor Birgeneau for being here and in welcoming him.
I thought Jack was going to say, and a fellow Canadian, but we try to sort of suppress that kind of information. So welcome to the third annual Matsui Forum, which is a program, as you heard, to honor the late Congressman Robert T. Matsui. Congressman Matsui was a graduate of Cal who went on to serve as one of California's most distinguished public servants, representing the Sacramento area in the United States Congress for 26 years. And I remember one of my early, not tasks, because it was a pleasure, activities when I became Chancellor of Berkeley was going to D.C. and meeting with his spouse, Doris Matsui, and talking to her about the concept of creating such a center at Berkeley, which we were very excited about. And so it's just wonderful to be able to participate in an activity which came out of the early work all of us did on founding the center. The university honors Robert Matsui's legacy through the Robert T. Matsui Center for Politics and Public Service, which organized tonight's event, as you just heard. The Matsui Center engages Cal students in public life through internships, public events, and the presence of distinguished visitors on campus, as evidenced by our panel. The center frequently works with student political groups, and tonight's event is co-sponsored by 4 student organizations: the Cal Democrats, the Berkeley College Republicans. Yes, we do have Republicans at Berkeley, lots of fine Republicans. The Undergraduate Political Science Association and the Berkeley Political Review. Tonight's event addresses an issue of great national importance How was the country changed by the tragedy of 9/11? 10 years after that horrific event, we hope to gain some perspective about the ways in which 9/11 impacted our lives as Americans. And just as an aside, I got interviewed earlier today by the Daily Cal, who are having a video on sort of various members of our community's feelings about 9/11. And I started out by saying, for people of my generation, there are two unforgettable moments in your life. Three, Mary Catherine, when I got married. Said I do. Sorry. And two others. One was, every one of us remembers the fine details of when we heard that President Kennedy had been assassinated. Everything about it. The feeling, everything. I was a graduate student at Yale at the time, and I remember it in great detail. And we remember when we first got informed about 9/11 and exactly what was happening. So these were two singular events in American history, which had a huge impact on our country and on the psychologies of almost every individual person. Remarkable, in fact. So now, after 10 years, we have time for some calm reflection, we hope. And of course, this is one of the purposes of a great university. And I'm happy tonight that Cal is contributing to a serious, thoughtful analysis of the extraordinary events of 9/11 and subsequent events. To guide the conversation, we have an excellent moderator, one who's already familiar to many of you, namely Michael Krasny, who's the host of Forum on KQED, which is the most listened to locally produced talk show on public radio. He's also a distinguished scholar and author, a professor of English at San Francisco State University, and the author of two books, Off Mic, a memoir of talk radio, and Spiritual Envy, an agnostic's quest. So please help me welcome Mr. Krasny and the forum panelists.
Thank you, Chancellor, and thank you all for being here. We're, of course, embarking on a discussion that is of great concern to us as Americans and also has tremendous international scope to it as well. And I'm pleased to be here talking to these three distinguished academics. We will have, as has been indicated, an opportunity for you to put your own questions into the mix after talking for about an hour or so. We'll have about a half hour of questions that you can simply, when I ask you to, send up forward here, and we'll collect them and certainly try to give everyone a fair amount of time. When we talk about commemorating 9/11, as the Chancellor did, what comes to my mind is the fact that the name of this evening's discussion is 9/11, 10 years later, and how did the attack change America? I must tell you that my mind immediately goes to the losses of thousands of people. And that commemoration ought to be probably, in some ways, foremost in our mind, because it's not only fellow citizens whose lives we lost, fellow human beings, but people whose lives dramatically were affected by the loss of those lives, family members, friends, associates, and so forth. And lest we forget, it seems to me, that needs to be the first thing that I at least wanted to mention. I heard, interestingly enough, this morning on a competing radio station, I do listen occasionally, talking about how so many of the people who were affected by 9/11 in terms of the deaths wanted to retire the word closure, that the word closure didn't really exist for them. It's a psychological word that's been given probably an inflated amount of importance. And even after 10 years, I think there are many people who are suffering the losses of loved ones and of friends. And so I wanted to bring that as immediately to mind as I can. I also wanted to say, by way of framing this evening's discussion, that 9/11 had an enormous personal effect on me, not only because of some of the people I knew, but also simply because it really changed the configuration of how I saw the world. And I write about this in my book, Off Mic, which the Chancellor was kind enough to mention. But we're probably going to talk more about how it's changed the whole landscape, psychologically, of course, but politically, economically, in terms of how America sees itself and how America is viewed in the world, and also generations and how they've been affected. Let me introduce this distinguished panel that we've assembled here this evening. Immediately to my left is Jean Bethke Elshtain, who is author of Just War Against Terror, The Burden of American Power in a Violent World. She joined me recently on Forum, in fact, because we've been doing some programming related to the memory of 9/11. She holds the Laura Spelman Rockefeller Professorship of Social and Political Ethics at the Divinity School at the University of Chicago, and we welcome you this evening. Thank you for joining us. We also have with us this evening James T. Patterson, who is author of Grand Expectations. I almost said Great Expectations. That's Dickens. The United States, 1945 to 1974, and a book called Restless Giant, The United States from Watergate to Bush v. Gore. He's Ford Foundation Professor of History Emeritus from Brown University, and we're delighted to have you with us this evening, James Patterson. And we also have one of your own, and someone who has brought gravitas to my program and has been with me many times, Michael Knox, who's Professor of Public Policy and former Dean of the Goldman School of Public Policy here at UC Berkeley, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Strategic Affairs with the U.S. Department of Defense, and now, as I kidded him before we mounted the stage here, doing more outsourcing work, but I know you're happy to have him back here at Cal. Michael Knox. Well, I thought a good place to begin, because the perspectives, obviously, as you can tell from the biographical sketch of each of our guests, is different, and their expertise is different. And we didn't want to go into the usual, let's everybody make a statement. What we want to do, in fact, is have a conversation. But I thought I'd begin by asking each of those who are participating up here on stage this evening to talk about, notwithstanding, of course, the great loss that I had mentioned of human lives, what remains in your mind, or what sort of stays in your mind, and perhaps your heart as well, after 10 years, if you were to sort of triage this as the primary or the main kind of thing, the most monumental thing to focus on in terms of what we look back at and what we feel the impact of to this day. Jean, can we begin with you?
Well, thank you. First of all, I'm delighted to be here. It's very difficult to separate out one's views on the long-range impact of 9/11 from one's immediate response to it, which you mentioned so eloquently, in the loss of life. Certainly the images that come flooding back in as you see the photos again, and the scenes of people fleeing the disaster remind you of what you were going through as you reflected on these horrible events. And there are a couple of things that I wanted to say about that. One was that we saw the best of America come out in many ways, a kind of activation of American civil society. The great Alexis de Tocqueville, as you know, wrote this classic on democracy in America and talked about the associational enthusiasm that characterized the American polity, talked about the habits of the heart that generated a sense of citizenship. And Mike, you talked about fellow citizens. That's what really struck me. These are our fellow citizens. That there's something like a sense of civic brotherhood and sisterhood that appears in a moment, it seems, of calamity. But it catalyzed the extraordinary responses, people just stopping their jobs, leaving what they were doing, flooding to New York to see what they could do to help. So all those aspects of civil society that are quiescent much of the time, so to speak, suddenly gushed forth, if you will, in an extraordinary display of solidarity. And that was an amazing thing to witness. Excuse me. The other point that I wanted to make is a more personal one, but it speaks to the issue of how generations remember terrible events. My grandchildren, 3 of them, were alive at the time. I have a 4th. It was born after 9/11, quite young. And we were very concerned about how the grandchildren would process this horrible event, trying to shield them from the news and so forth. They spent a lot of time drawing pictures of airplanes flying into buildings. And I asked the oldest granddaughter before I came here, she's a senior in high school now, I said, "Joanne, what do you remember of 9/11? She said, I remember shocked faces, and I remember drawing lots of pictures of buildings falling down and airplanes flying into them." And I travel a lot, so the grandkids were asking, "Grandma, what happens if And the correct answer is, well, there's no more grandma, but I'm obviously not going to tell them that. So I had to think of another way to discuss this with the children. So it hit me that that's an extraordinary thing to have as your first political memory, in a sense, of some horrific event that led to tremendous human suffering. One final point. And that is in the aftermath, and it's ongoing, and you're going to hear a lot of it from my distinguished co-panelists. And that is the question of how, as a society, politically, we responded externally, so to speak. Although the domestic and the foreign cannot be separated, we do talk that way for analytic purposes. And it struck me that there were two kinds of tendencies that emerged. One was a tendency to draw back in. There's a strong, as you know, isolationist tradition in American life. The notion was this is what happens when you muck about in the world. We've got to sort of draw ourselves in, pay attention to our own society. The other reaction was, in fact, that we do need to engage the world, and we need to do it more knowingly, more tellingly, and perhaps even more dramatically, and at times more aggressively. And what America is in part all about, where security is concerned, is that we extend our spheres of responsibility in the interest of certain values and norms, but also in the interest of our own security. 9/11 reminded us of what the state is there to do in the most primordial sense, which is to protect its citizens. It's something that Americans hadn't been reminded of for a long time. And I think the lingering effect of that obviously continues.
Thank you. Can we pass the torch on to you, James Patterson?
Yes. I'm going to do a little bit of history because that's my field. It was mentioned in the introduction, the two things that people remember who aren't terribly old, the assassination of John Kennedy and the 9/11. I would add Pearl Harbor as the third thing that none of us here probably remembers personally, but of the three events in American history over the last 70 years that had the most profound emotional effect and in other ways policy effects, which I'll come to, I would list these three, and maybe others will mention others, the Vietnam War or something, but as one-time sudden events. And of course, Pearl Harbor and 9/11 share the obvious, a sudden and unexpected and unimaginable attack on a population which historically has enjoyed free security, mainly because of the oceans. And so it was an enormous surprise that Pearl Harbor took place, and an equally enormous surprise for Americans in 2001. I think that in the aftermath of the ending of the Cold War, which of course ended in the early 90s, there was a certain complacency, a kind of muscular, we're wonderful, we're good, everybody likes us, we have no enemies that can hurt us. And we overlooked the history of our Middle Eastern policies. The closeness with the Shah of Iran, for instance, being the first and most obvious example. And we're thus entirely surprised that anybody would do this to us. And historically, Americans have always felt themselves to have, if you've studied American history, you've probably heard the term manifest destiny, which was a term in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. America had a manifest destiny to spread and promote the ideals of democracy and freedom that were the essence of American nationality. We're not a nation because of ethnicity, we're a nation because of these ideas. And this strong messianic tendency, this sense to feel that we really are doing good things for the world isn't all wrong, but it's especially strong. And so when this happened on 9/11, I think it was all the more hurtful and confusing, and still is. Of the three, I would say that the 9/11 probably had the most emotional effect. Pearl Harbor was far away. It happened to a place very few Americans had ever heard of. There was no television to speak of. And Roosevelt didn't tell the people a whole lot about what was happening. We just knew that it had been an attack. It got us, of course, into the war with Japan. And because Germany foolishly declared war upon the United States, which they did not have to do by treaty, we immediately responded in kind and were involved in the Second World War. So I'm not trying to maintain that the Pearl Harbor attack had no impact on policy. It did. It greatly hastened our entrance into a war, but I think it hastened our entrance into a war which we almost certainly would have been into. Historians never like to use the word inevitable, and I'm not. But we were certainly moving in that direction. There was a shooting war on the Atlantic, and the Japanese were very much at loggerheads with us in 1941. So I'm not saying it was of no importance, but I think it just hastened something that was going to happen. The assassination of Kennedy, this gets us into contemporary political, probably, preferences, and the amazing argument which has provoked any numbers of books by historians on would Kennedy have gotten us involved in the Vietnam War if he hadn't been assassinated? And Kennedy fans and historians say no. Many others say they're not sure, which is mine. And some say he probably would have. But I would say that the assassination of Kennedy's effect on policy is hard to judge in terms of the Vietnam War. And what Johnson did in domestic policy was to get past, because of the great affection for Kennedy, which he made magnificent political use of by saying that we owe this to his memory. All the great society programs were passed within a couple of years. Medicare, Medicaid, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, immigration reform, which removed the discriminatory immigration laws that we'd had since the 1920s, mainly against Asians, and a host of other pieces of legislation were passed by Johnson, which Kennedy had tried to get passed, but could not because of the congressional difficulties that he, like a lot of liberal presidents or semi-liberal presidents, had faced. So you could say that the assassination of Kennedy in some bizarre and horrible way promoted a lot of liberal legislation that might otherwise not have passed. You can also argue, although as I say, you can also argue against it, that it brought to power a president who was more likely to get involved in the war in Vietnam than Kennedy would have been. But as I say, the effects on policy were probably not dramatic unless you believe the Vietnam story, which, as I say, I do not. 9/11, though, definitely changed policy in a major way. As you may remember, President Bush II came to office having run a campaign in which he opposed nation building. You could say that he was something in the isolationist tradition of American foreign policy thinking, which has had a particularly strong house in the Republican Party, although they're very divided on these issues. But this changed with dramatic suddenness, as you know, and within 2 years we had a Patriot Act, which many Democrats voted for. We have Department of Homeland Security. We have a TSA, which gets $8 billion a year. We have 2 wars, some of the longest in American history. This is, I think, 9/11 has had the most impact on American foreign policy of any event in modern history, and more so than either Pearl Harbor or the assassination of Kennedy. This may not surprise anybody, but it is some kind of historical sets of comparison that may prove of interest.
Thank you, Jim. Michael Knott.
The government officials.
Well, I would say,
And it goes back to many of the points Professor Patterson raised about the prior sense of, 2 oceans, 2 relatively weak border countries, a sense of invulnerability. There was always a threat among people of our generations about nuclear attack from the Soviet Union, but it was viewed as a low probability event. And especially after we got through the 60s, that probability really plummeted. But now you have a situation where at any time, at any place, people could even sacrifice their own lives to kill you. kill you, your grandchildren, your neighbors, your university, your churches, or whatever. A key distinction, by the way, between Pearl Harbor, which I think there were 2,300 fatalities, and 9/11, there were 2,900 fatalities. First of all, that means 9/11 was the single, as measured by number of people killed, was the single greatest disaster in American history. A key distinction between the two is, to use a terminology actually goes back to nuclear strategy, is Pearl Harbor was a counter-military strike. The Japanese weren't trying to kill people in downtown Honolulu. They were going after our battleships, our aircraft carriers, our planes. They wanted to destroy our ability to bring the war to them. It's a counter-military strike. Obviously, 9/11 was a counter-population strike. They wanted to kill as many civilians as they could. Muslims, Christians, Jews, people in the Pentagon. Almost certainly the flight that was redirected and fell into the Pennsylvania fields was headed either for the Congress or the White House. So there was an effort to so-called decapitate the United States against the Pentagon, the Congress, and the White House. And that, in its boldness, in its comprehensiveness, in its execution, was really, despite the fact that there was intelligence that something was coming and that they even might use planes in the attack, what happened was really unthinkable, but it happened in front of our eyes. And every president in the future of whatever party or persuasion has to be worried foremost about that indefinitely, until such time as the whole threat seems to disappear. And we're a long way from that. Some of you may have heard that there was a threat announced today by the Department of Homeland Security, which is very rare, by Janet Napolitano, Secretary, that they have credible evidence of a planned attack in Washington, against Washington or New York on Sunday, on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. And they even went so far as to give some information about it, a truck bomb with 3 people, one of whom is an American citizen, but they have limited information. They're doing this, of course, also to alert citizens. Because as you know, if you followed, for example, when the truck bomber went into Times Square, it was a vendor on the street corner of Times Square that alerted the police that this man was acting very strangely. If he hadn't alerted the police, that guy might have detonated the device, and a lot of people would have been killed in Times Square. So the people have to be vigilant. I must say, having been at Berkeley at the time of 9/11 and been here ever since, but being back in Washington a fair amount, there is a bit of a disconnect, I think, between this feeling of vulnerability that the Washingtonians and New Yorkers have and the feeling in California. I don't think most Californians can really relate to it, even though, in fact, several of the flights were headed to California. Many Californians were killed on those flights, and many families have suffered since. But there is a sense of remoteness, that we're 3,000 miles away, they'd never attack us, all of which is, I think, on very shaky ground. But the other point I'd make is an economic point. From what we know about bin Laden and al-Qaeda's strategy, their aim was to provoke the United States to go into Afghanistan, where they thought we'd be in a quagmire for 10 years, and congratulations. And they also thought that we'd to use American lingo, we'd so rev up our expenditures that it could really strain us, even bankrupt us. Remember, when George W. Bush became president, he inherited a major budget surplus. I know this is now a theoretical construct for some of you younger people, but there was a budget surplus. I was in the Clinton administration, and Clinton's probably proudest achievement was he turned the economy around. Economists were writing in the 80s that high inflation was a permanent fixture of the American economy. By the end of Clinton's 2 terms, there was low inflation and a huge budget surplus. 10 years later, well, you know the story. We have unprecedented debt, unprecedented deficits. As far as the eye can see, it's not, of course, all related to 9/11. There's the real estate crisis and all the rest. But the economic weakness of the United States was greatly accelerated by our response to 9/11. And I think those two, from a policy perspective, are the most important features of the attack.
Actually, I'm glad, Michael, that you brought in economics, because I think, sort of tying in with also what Jim Patterson said, the amount of blood and loss of lives in Iraq and Afghanistan is horrendous, of course, to take calculation of, but it's also depleted our coffers in ways that we had never imagined. I mean, certainly, if you link those two wars directly to 9/11, which I believe we're doing here, then not only has our economy been disrupted the way al-Zawahiri and others of al-Qaeda said they wanted to have 9/11 be a catalyst for, but of course, so is our cherished youth and those who have gone off to fight in this war. So the two wars are certainly linked, but I'm wondering, as we now look at what's going on in the Middle East, and as we look at the so-called Arab Spring, which is taking on many darker and more disturbing facets to it, particularly in Libya and in Syria especially, how much of 9/11 plays into now the United States looking geopolitically at what its role is going to be ongoing? I remember after 9/11, there were these headlines blazed around, why do they hate us? And the notion was they were, of course, members of the Islamic faith and those who were fanatical as a result of their tie to the Muslim ideas of jihad and the like. What about shaping geopolitical policy? I'll go to you on this first, Mike, because you've been so integral in your role forming that policy.
Well, I mean, we are deeply enmeshed in almost all parts of the world, even in many areas we don't know much about. We're not well prepared. But it's actually a forward strategy to prevent the sort of thing that happened in 9/11. But it may be misguided, but that's the fundamental objective. We're in Afghanistan because if we don't get Afghanistan right, it'll happen again, because the 9/11 attack originated in Afghanistan, one of the remote parts of the world, one of the poorest countries in the world, a country 99 out of 100 Americans couldn't spell. So it's forced us to move out and perhaps overstretched ourselves.
So what you talked about is permanent vulnerability, and not only extends to our own sense of protecting our ports and protecting ourselves from car bombs and the like, but Somalia might become a place for a Taliban type of takeover that would lead to al-Qaeda's being
absolutely, and there's no end to it.
Yemen.
Because there's no end, if I may, because there's no end to, it seems, to the number of failed states. And failed states are ripe, obviously, for chaos and confusion, and for outfits like al-Qaeda to set up shop and proliferate their training camps and all the rest. I mean, I do want to say about Afghanistan that it's, clearly any American president, whether it's Bush or someone else was in office at that time, had to respond to what happened. And it is important to remember about Afghanistan that it had overwhelming support, not only in Congress, but also from the international community. As you know, it was a collective, considered a collective security measure, not just a particular concern of the United States. So it's important to put that into the mix as we talk about these things. I'm not saying that it didn't have the deleterious effects that you noted, economically speaking, but I think it does suggest to us how difficult it is to figure out how to respond to these kinds of threats from non-state actors, as people in international relations talk about them, and to figure out what to do. And certainly Afghanistan, there was a strong case to make for going in there, obviously. And there were many people, including folks on the left and the right, and in the middle, arguing that this was a war of self-defense and a necessary war. Certainly the current president made that argument himself. So I think that we can't just lament what has happened, but I think we can use some of these examples to illustrate the difficulty of responding. One of my good friends who at the time of the Bosnian massacres and ethnic cleansing was a deputy foreign minister of the Czech Republic, what became the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, I believe still at that moment, said that being a superpower is a very difficult thing. You're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And I think we see some of that in our Middle Eastern policy and responses. We should be out in front and encouraging what's happening in Egypt. We should be out in front and leading the West to do something about Gaddafi and so on. There's a position known as liberal interventionism which has strong advocates in the Obama administration, and it really is an interventionist position. And it's one that argues that our security is ineluctably tied to the domestic arrangements of states, how they organize themselves. And if you have failed states or if you have authoritarian states, their behavior is more likely to be unpredictable and more likely to sow discord and violence, and it poses a security threat to us. So if you look actually at President Bush's speeches and you put them side by side with the speeches of many people who are Democrats and who are liberal interventionists, there's not much difference. I mean, it's a strong interventionist position. You have to weigh the cases, obviously, but the insistence is that our security is tied to these matters. This isn't just an issue of we want the world to be like us.
Ironically, as Michael Knox said, though, ironically from the position of going back to the Bush administration, the administration has said it was opposed under any circumstances to nation building. But that's what we've got. In terms of the economics, again, we have sunk so much money not only in the war in Afghanistan, but trying to essentially nation build, or what is in effect nation building, and we're sinking millions and millions, billions of millions of dollars into Pakistan, thinking that Pakistan would give us the kind of security which, of course, we haven't received from Pakistan. And in the light of what happened with the assassination of bin Laden, it seems as if Pakistan had been double dealing it just like we suspected all along.
Right, but Pakistan isn't a case, and then my colleague should speak to this as well, isn't a case of nation building. That's a case of trying to prevent...
No, but I'm talking about the economics.
A nation from
just
falling apart,
putting all of that money into
sure.
and bleeding our own coffers. In fact...
Sure, but if you try to think of what the alternatives would be, I mean, I think, again, you can point to all the particulars and the negative implications, but, I think that one is also obliged to think of what reasonable alternative responses would be to situations like the unraveling in Pakistan, a country that has nuclear weapons, and the dangers if radical Islamists should ever get hold of those. So I think that the issue of vulnerability has been raised, and I think I want to put another one on here, and that's tremendous uncertainty. I mean, just an awareness of the extraordinary complexity of the world. I think we have a tendency to make the world too simple, and when you're sort of riding high, things look pretty simple. We're the superpower, we're untouchable. And now we're not only aware of our vulnerability, but we're deeply aware of, and it's quite unsettling, of the density and complexity of these events, and the fact that it is very difficult to get it right.
Well, maybe it's taken away some American hubris, though. I mean, one can hope for that, at least. And also, when you were talking about the best of America being brought together by 9/11, I was thinking, headline of Newsweek, I just happened to notice on the newsstand, resilience. And they're talking about that as being, again, a sign of our strength. And I want to go back to James Patterson to get the historical perspective some more on this, because when we're talking about that vulnerability, I mean, you can remember during the Bush administration, the red lights and the green lights and all these warnings of, one sort or another that pretty much Vice President Cheney has set forth. Now we seem to, because we've been lucky, we haven't had these kind of bombings like they had. We came very close on a number of occasions, but like they had to suffer in Europe. And as a result, I'm wondering if you see a sort of shift now to not necessarily complacency, but certainly to less of a feeling of vulnerability. Now we're coming on this momentous occasion of the decade, but nevertheless there does seem to have been, just out of luck, a kind of ebbing away, hasn't there?
I think I was reading recently of a poll that suggested something like 2/3 to 70% of the American population thought that we are considerably more secure against these kinds of things than we were in 2001. Of course, that's, given what happened, I suppose that's obvious. But I think I wouldn't call it a complacency. 30% think otherwise, or 35%. And I certainly agree with what was said here, that as far as policymakers are concerned, there is a sense that we are permanently in danger and must permanently put at the very top of what we do measures which will spend whatever is necessary and do whatever is necessary to prevent something like this from happening again. I think in terms of foreign policy, you were talking about America being the leader. You've heard this phrase, of course, having to do with Obama's handling of Libya, that we're leading from behind. And I think that's an unfair phrase. I think we're very much in it, but we are trying to avoid being out in front involving every nation that has internal difficulties and problems. And I think we are pulling back to some degree from the liberal interventionist nation-building kinds of thinking that President Bush was pushing for earlier in this decade.
Libya was framed as human rights, whereas Iraq was framed more in terms of getting rid of a terrible despot and somehow,
and human rights were always
human rights to a degree, but most Americans who were polled, I was talking about American polls, as I'm sure all of you are well aware, thought that Saddam Hussein had a hand involved in 9/11, which he did not. And they also thought that he had, of course, weapons of mass destruction.
Well, these are mistakes. I mean, we were wrong about those things. But you're quite right that Osama really
made that mistake on air more times.
He really had the notion, and it really worked beautifully, that this would get us into a long and costly and bloody war in Afghanistan from which we'd never extricate ourselves, as other nations had learned, to their dismay, the Russians and the British and so forth, and that this would really tie us up and mess up our economy. So he wasn't mad because we were close to Israel. I mean, that was not his main complaint. It was that we were too close. We had military troops in Saudi Arabia.
I'm also thinking Americans are very reactive. After 9/11, there was immense fear throughout the land. I mean, some of you were probably I don't know how well you remember this. You got 18, 19-year-old college students who were 8 or 9 at the time, but there was fear of getting on airplanes. There still is. I mean, when you think about all the things you go through to get on an airplane today, that's really because of 9/11.
I'm flying back on September 11th, and now I hear that I have to go to Providence, Rhode Island. I don't know when I'll get there.
But the nervousness, we were talking about how remote California was. I remember people saying, are they going to try to blow up the Golden Gate Bridge? This is an important monument. They like to get big monuments and things that have historical relevance like that. They obviously did that in 9/11. Do we have to worry about the Bay Bridge? Are we going to be worrying about attacks by loners, lone wolves, so to speak, just in your average shopping center and so forth? To some extent, that seems to have ebbed. I mean, but yet we're on constant alert, and people are being vigilant. Like Michael Knox said, we would have had a disaster in New York if it hadn't been for vigilance.
Yeah, I thought a lot about when I was asked to be on this panel, what kind of generalizations I could make about American people's fears. You can get at this a little bit with the polls, but the polls ask fairly simple questions sometimes that don't get at the complexity of how people feel. I have the sense, but it's just a personal sense, and I'd like to see what people think, that most people most of the time don't think very much about 9/11 anymore. Clearly the polls show that overwhelmingly the big issue is the economy, and has been for 3 years. We elected a president in 2008 who had almost no international experience. If we had been deeply concerned about international issues and security policies, presumably he would not have been elected. So it's hard to say.
How about in this coming election? Do you think, certainly 9/11 was used politically to a great extent. In fact, I remember, I shouldn't drop this name, but I remember giving a talk at Stanford and saying that there was a tremendous relationship between candidates perceived as being strong. Bush as a cowboy was perceived as being strong. Arnold Schwarzenegger even was perceived as being strong. And this, not only with the weightlifting, but this carried a lot of weight, so to speak. And I wonder to what extent it still does politically. If they see Rick Perry as being, kind of a strong force, and maybe he doesn't believe in evolution, and maybe he doesn't believe in global warming, but, he's a tough guy again.
The American people have elected a lot of generals, starting with George Washington, but many others, Eisenhower, Grant.
I think there's a yearning for General Petraeus. I've heard people talk about, when is Petraeus going to get it, and is he going to do it this year or 4 years from now? So I think that's.
They gave him the CIA, didn't they?
I think that's. Let's get him there, and maybe he won't run because there's other job to do. But let me just say briefly, one of your questions about thinking about 9/11 in your comments, Jim. It strikes me that no, we don't most of the time. But I think it's just beneath the surface. And it doesn't take very much to trigger it. And to trigger especially in the places that were hit. But it is there. There's this terrible sense of unease. And of course it promotes mistrust. Is the person next to you possibly with a big, heavy, sort of puffy coat, possibly a lone wolf suicide bomber, those sorts of things when threats are being mentioned. So I think it's just there, and what it does over the long run to our sociality, to our sense of being compatriots with others, I'm not quite sure, but I think there is that strong sort of notion that there are things that we should fear, but you can't live in a constant state of fear. You simply can't live that way. You may recall that after, some of you will at least, after 9/11, there were all these editorials and so on about how we wouldn't be cheerful again, we wouldn't laugh again, that the sense of irony was utterly destroyed among us. Well, that's obviously silly to make claims of that sort. Life goes on. I think there's a deep sort of hopefulness that's part of the human makeup in some sense, and there are all sorts of reasons for people to be joyful and to look at the world in a way that's not optimistic necessarily, but hopeful. But I think this undercurrent is there.
I think it took about 2 or 3 weeks before Letterman and Leno started cracking
jokes again. Yeah, but it was going to happen. It happened.
Michael Nye?
I'd like to raise one issue that we haven't addressed yet, and that's the inherent tension in a democracy between national security concerns and civil liberties. The democratic governments are somewhat malleable. I mean, there's no explicit game plan. Events affect policies, policies affect events. And in a period of low perceived threat, which I would characterize as the 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. I served in the Clinton administration at that time. I mean, I can tell you, as someone who's deeply involved in Russian affairs, the main aim was to further the democratization of Russia. And arms control and reducing nuclear weapons, these are just little pawns in the game of, they were going to become just like us. That was Clinton's big concern. Now, of course, there was Bosnia, there were regional problems, but there was no sense of an existential threat at all.
Right.
And therefore, if I was late for a flight at SFO, because I went too long on my lecture at Berkeley, and I zipped to SFO, and it was 20 minutes before the flight, I could say, well, I forgot, I'm tired, I'm an old guy, let me on.
You're a professor.
I'm a professor.
Yeah.
Don't hold it against me. I'm from Berkeley, really don't hold it against me. And, I could probably talk my way on. Now, I mean, after, that was true up through September 10th, 2001. Starting September 12th, well, of course, there weren't any flights flying on September 12th, but after we got back, now, I have to take off my belt, they smell my shoes. These are direct infringements on my civil liberties. They're constraints on my civil liberties, but for a greater cause, which is to preserve national security. So it's a kind of teeter-totter or seesaw situation. Low perceived threat, high civil liberties, low national security sense. High perceived threat, high national security, reduced civil liberties, I mean, the Bush team was accused of eavesdropping on telephones and intercepting emails and all that. And, we're not quite sure even today what is being practiced there. The whole issue of cyber war, which I was engaged in this most recent stint in the Pentagon, raises other questions about civil liberty, the inherent tension. And I think now, since it's been 10 years and we haven't had any more attacks, thank goodness, the issues of civil liberties are being restored and the sense of threat is being reduced, but then you get something like what happened today or something else, and that's a change. That is an absolute change.
If I may, since you brought up civil liberties and democracy, and Gene, I'm going to go to you on this.
Sure.
Because we talked a bit about this on the air. There's obviously been an increase in Islamophobia, and there's been a great deal of concern among those who value this democracy and the pluralism of American republic that we live in, that everybody be treated equitably, and yet there's more suspicion, there's more paranoia. People who are darker or people who are Muslim are suffering, really, in many respects, ongoing. Even though, again, if you trust the polls tell us that 71% roughly of Muslim Americans feel very pleased about being here in America. And unlike other countries where those numbers are much lower, they feel that they've assimilated or acculturated to a degree, and they feel pleased about being here, and they don't feel very positive about any of the terrorism that we associate with al-Qaeda. So this has had an effect on our democracy and our way of life that really in some ways is immeasurable, has it not?
Well, I think one can overdo the notion of Islamophobia. I think the best people to address this are American Muslims themselves, and if we take them at their word, they're, as you say, a considerable majority are happy to be here and to be part of this polity. I'm part of some ongoing dialogues with Muslim Americans and with Muslim scholars and intellectuals from the Middle East, but certainly the Muslim Americans internally, the view that I've heard expressed is that they believe the reaction after 9/11 was considerably softened by comparison to what happened in World War II with the internment of the Nisei, what happened in World War I with the attacks on so-called hyphenated Americans, massive deportations, patriotic lynchings, and all the rest. So I think that, and of course mosques keep being built. I mean, there was the controversy over the World Trade Center, but there are about 2,000 mosques in the United States. So I think that we need to take account of that and the fact that many Muslim Americans point to the kinds of restrictions that have been put in place in France and elsewhere as part of a system of very, very strict separation on the level of civil society of religion and public life.
Can I ask you to put on your divinity school hat for a moment and tell me something else?
That's what I'm doing.
Well, no, but I'd be interested to know whether you think that there's been more secularization as a result of 9/11 or more of a drawing in of religion. Now, there are many people who say if 9/11 could happen, how could God exist, really, is what one hears.
Well, I mean, I can't answer that kind of existential question. We can have a long discussion afterwards, but I have...
I'm just asking you what the effect, what you would think the effect
about the theodicy question, but...
Well, the theodicy question, I mean, how can evil exist?
Yeah, exactly. But if you put on the divinity school hat, I mean, I thought that I was in fact doing that by talking about the question of religion and civil society. And we know with a very strict, in French, the laïcité system, that, as you know, Muslim schoolgirls are not permitted to wear the headscarf to school and so forth. So Muslim Americans are quite grateful that those kinds of restrictions are not in place because we're not nearly so strict about those kinds of things as they are in many parts of Western Europe. And I think we're right to be not so strict about that because you talked about the issue of diversity and accepting difference. Well, if you're going to do that, you need to accept some of the marks of difference, surely. And the way people attire themselves and symbols that they display are part of that. I think at the same time it's important to insist that, when people come to a democracy that's based on, however imperfectly we sometimes achieve it, on human rights, that they can and should be expected to conform to those standards. And, and you can't have a situation where part of an immigrant population is being systematically mistreated or kept from the free exercise of their fundamental human rights. So, I think you walk a fine line here. Again, it's like the line between order and between liberty and security. Here again, how much difference do we think we should celebrate and acknowledge, and what's the point where difference becomes destructive and a destructive division, and we are right to try to curb some of it. And that's something that's endlessly contested in American life. And I think the issue of Islamophobia, as you put it, the whole question of a highly religious group of immigrants and how they express their faith has raised those questions all over again.
Go back, if I may, James Patterson, something you said before about all that legislation that may have been the result of the Kennedy assassination during the Johnson administration. And I wonder, when we look back at the Bush administration, we think of the Patriot Act, we think of all of these things that have to do with the vulnerability that Michael Knock was suggesting. Is there anything that a historian would look at in what the Bush administration pushed for that would be put on the positive side as a result of 9/11?
Well, I think it's true, as you said before, that the decision to fight in Afghanistan was a near unanimous bipartisan decision in 2002, and that one of his first statements, of course, was to warn against Islamophobia, which surprised a lot of people and was a very fine statement.
What he talked about is Islam is the religion of peace, in fact.
Yeah, he said we should not take this out on Muslims
visited a
in
mosque.
general. This was one.
He used the bully pulpit and used it well.
And for a while, as you said earlier, there was this great sense of solidarity. That's the word. And I think what a lot of Americans are sad about, and I read it in the newspaper now with all these stories that we're having now as 9/11 approaches, of how much that's been lost and how much divisiveness there is. But it should be remembered that not all, or maybe even most of that, is because of our foreign policies or our national security policies. It has to do with economics, once again. This is almost always the biggest issue in American life, almost always the biggest issue in American presidential elections, historically speaking. And it's very close to the daily lives of people all the time, whether they're unemployed or not. So what else did Bush do it's hard necessarily to credit Homeland Security or the Patriot Act or any of these other things, but he was able to go out of office by saying it didn't happen again. And I'm hoping Obama can say the same thing. But if he doesn't, I wouldn't blame him. I mean, this security it's anything can happen. We had a person, with wasn't until 2006 that we knew that you could blow up a plane with liquids in a bottle. And just last year we had bombs in Parcel Post in the bay of an airplane coming from Yemen.
It seems like every time something happens, we have to be reactive with more security, to the point now where you've got these X-ray type of things operating. So tennis shoes, we're at the shoes and so forth. But
I'll just say one other thing about civil liberties. I don't mean to suggest here that we should be cavalier about it. I feel very strongly about it. Again, the point you make is very true. Historically speaking, Americans have not been great civil libertarians, and certainly never during wars. From the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798 to Lincoln and the suspension of habeas corpus, to the horrible Red Scare following World War I, to the relocation camps for the Japanese Americans, to McCarthyism, on and on and on. Nor is the political polarization that people talks about something that I would attribute to 9/11. Don't we remember that just 2 or 3 years before that, Clinton was impeached? I mean, our politics have been polarized for a long time, and we cannot blame everything that's wrong with our country on 9/11 or on President Bush. These have deeper historical roots, which is why I started with the comments I did about the history.
But before 9/11, the biggest story was the Chandra Levy, Gary Condit affair and death of the young girl who had been having an affair with a congressman. I mean, our media has changed in the whole sense of that. I want to go to actually a final question for you, Michael Knock. But if I could ask those of you who have written down questions to pass them forward, and we'll collect them, and we'll try to bring as many in as we can. Ethan, you're going to do the collecting? This young gentleman, thank you. Thank you for your participation. Of course, Michael Knock, the question I need to ask you at this point, and it's almost a platitudinous one, is are we safer now than we were 10 years ago? Because there's been so much that has been put into motion as a result of 9/11 in terms of secure, not necessarily secure borders, but in the name of security, one form or another.
Well, I think actually it's a tough question to answer. It depends on how you measure it. If you measure it simply on have we been attacked since? No. 10 years later, that's quite an achievement. But the threat keeps adapting. And one point I wanted to make about the threat is that for quite a while now, Al-Qaeda has adopted a strategy of developing homegrown terrorists, non-Arab terrorists, people who don't look like Atta, but people who have blonde hair and blue eyes, or Africans from Nigeria, people who you don't expect to be causing difficulty. The man who was an army colonel and a medical doctor killed over 20 people at Fort Hood. The man who was from Nigeria was going to blow up himself in an airplane. And actually, some analysts argue today that the single most lethal aspect of the Al-Qaeda franchise, and of course it has been franchised out, because they didn't want to stay concentrated in Afghanistan because they knew the Americans were coming to Afghanistan, is Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, based in Yemen. Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, based in Yemen, is headed by a man named al-Awlaki. Al-Awlaki was born in New Mexico. He has a bachelor's degree in civil engineering from Colorado State University. He has a master's degree from San Diego State. He was a doctoral student at GW. And his father was from Yemen. And he went to Yemen and he became transformed by the bin Laden ideology.
He's all over, of course, the YouTube, and is being seen by many potential lone wolves, I suppose.
Al-Awlaki is the person who the Nigerian has told us was his inspiration to attack. Al-Awlaki is the one who the Army colonel said was his inspiration to attack. The man who drove the van from Connecticut into Times Square. Al-Awlaki was the man who inspired him to attack. So, in a way, I mean, we call this in psychology adaptive learning. You know, organizations learn from failure and from problems. So Al-Qaeda is seeking to adapt, and they're making it more strenuous for us to deal with the problem. So at one level, yes, we're more safe, but underneath, you know,
they're taking out a lot of their leadership. As someone said recently, some sage said, you can't take away the idea of Al-Qaeda.
Right. But it is encouraging. It is encouraging that the Arab Spring, in all these countries across the Middle East, from Tunisia to Syria, has essentially nothing to do with Al-Qaeda ideology. They want freedom. They want democracy. They want elections. They want
jobs.
They want jobs. 30-40% unemployment in these by the youth. They want governments that aren't corrupt, where people are starving and the leaders live in palaces, even if they're underground. So that's what they want. And I think this is actually a big ideological blow to Al-Qaeda. That after 10 years, and you have these amazing revolutions related but also somewhat autonomous in one country after another, and Al-Qaeda is irrelevant. And that's actually a good sign for us. Now, what happens in the post-revolutionary stage, and whether Islamicists, anathema to the West, become in charge, that's a whole separate matter. But the cause of the overthrow of the Tunisian president, of Mubarak, of Gaddafi, of the fight against Assad, this has nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. In fact, they're blaming Al-Qaeda for instigating these people, which of course is fallacious.
Since you worked in defense, I have to ask you just a quick question. It's very much in the news and has been on my mind, and that is, there has been reports of surface-to-air missiles stolen from Libya that Libya had under control.
Yes.
And when you think of all the Libyans that went into Iraq to fight with Al-Qaeda in Iraq, you get very nervous about the thoughts.
Of course. I mean, there's a whole almost not quite subterranean arms issue here that's in the hundreds of billions of dollars. People are profiting from this. People have always profited from war, and put in the hands of people who are willing to destroy themselves to kill you. It can be very lethal. So yes, it's a very fluid and dangerous situation in Libya tonight.
Jean, you want to say?
I just wanted to very quickly say that I think we have to remember when we talk about the Arab Spring and the tumultuous events in the Middle East, remember the brave human rights protesters and advocates in those countries, you know, over the last decades, who've gone to prison and in some instances been killed precisely because they were arguing for freedom and for human rights. And it's really a tribute to them that their message got out as widely as it did, and we should acknowledge their contributions.
Well, I'll go to your questions, and I'll begin. Actually, I'll try to direct the questions to each of the individual panelists. Maybe the first one for you, Michael Knock. Is not the major effect the political sensation of permanent war, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, Iran, etc.?
Well, permanent war is a kind of phrase that's au courant at the moment. I actually think it's a mischaracterization of the reality. It's true, we went into Afghanistan, as my colleagues say, which was hugely supported in a bipartisan way, and in my view, totally justified. We then went into Iraq. That's a much different issue. Obama came in and doubled down in Afghanistan while incrementally withdrawing from Iraq. The Libyan thing was an effort to essentially save the people of Benghazi, overthrow Gaddafi without American boots on the ground. I think one of the lessons of this last decade is you're not going to see very easily of an American president committing American combat forces to another country. It doesn't mean we won't be there. It doesn't mean there won't be special operations. It doesn't mean there won't be the CIA, which also, by the way, that's another important change. The CIA has morphed into a paramilitary organization. They have carried out more military operations in the last decade than they did from 1947 to 2001. And there's a very close linkage between... It's not an accident that Petraeus, Army four-star general, father of the improvement in the Iraqi situation, father of counterinsurgency strategy, is now head of the CIA. It's because the CIA has a whole military arm. This may or may not be good, but it's a fact. It's a direct consequence of 9/11. So I don't think, if you want to call special operations permanent war, that's the way it's been for 5,000 years. Countries are involved with other countries in a militarized way, and that's not going to change. But in terms of major commitment, I think it's now going to be quite a while. In fact, Secretary Gates said before he left that, this is a widely quoted comment, he said, anytime, if there's another Secretary of Defense after me who urges that the President put a lot of troops on the ground in a country that we don't understand very well to build nations, they should have their head examined. This is Gates, who's a very cautious man, speaks very circumspectly. I've been in the room with him, I've briefed him. Can't say I know him intimately, but I've seen him up close. And to say that, I think really was saying his own angst at having to deal with Afghanistan and Iraq, and how once you get in, how can you get out? Very difficult.
Well, speaking about getting in and getting out, here's someone from the audience who says, how do we get back to, this may be an oxymoron, normal politics? I think we'll defer to our resident historian here, Jim Patterson, whatever normal politics means. Really, maybe the subtext of that question is, how do we get back to sort of a state of being that was more comfortable, more secure, more outside of this permanent vulnerability that we've been speaking of? Or can we ever get back to it?
Well, if I look back historically, I think that the polarization of our politics, as I mentioned before, certainly is not the result only of 9/11. And as I mentioned, the impeachment. One big thing was the insistence by Kennedy and then Johnson on passage of the Civil Rights Acts. And when those were passed, first the Civil Rights Act of 64 and then the Voting Rights Act of 65, Johnson, when these passed, he said, I think we've just lost the South. The Democratic Party has just lost the South forever.
He was right.
He was close to being right. The Democrats still do all right in some state elections in the South, but it is now an overwhelmingly northern urban party. You all know this. And the Republican Party, which used to have a lot of strength in the Northeast and other places in urban areas, has very little. So the parties became much more polarized along geographical and ideological lines, and they've been that way ever since the late 60s. In varying ways, this kind of polarization bedeviled Nixon, Carter, Reagan to some extent, Clinton. Clinton got a tax bill through in 1993 in which no Republican in the House voted for it. Sound familiar? This has a long history, and I don't see it changing. The other thing, and this is more, you have more expertise than I do, is the growing importance of religion in American politics, which I think has been exaggerated. But for a long time, evangelical and people of what you might call conservative religions, although that's a complicated word, many of them thought that messing around in politics would sully themselves. And that changed again, especially in the 60s and the 70s. And so the Republican Party has become more conservative, more rural, and the Democratic Party more liberal. And I don't see that these basic facts are going to change, or that we can expect our politics to become anything like consensual. And you certainly see it this year.
Thanks, Jim. It's a question maybe for you, Gene. What's the most important thing to remember about 9/11?
Well, this takes us right back to the beginning and to your comments. I think the most important thing to remember, obviously, is the horrors of that day and the victims, and not to lose sight of the and you mentioned this, and it needs to be stressed and underscored, of the ongoing sort of pain, if you will, and loss and so forth. It's not as if it happens and then people get over it. As you pointed out, it continues. So I think that's terribly important. And I would add to that another theme that's been mentioned here, and that is that you can never be absolutely secure. You simply can't. And you cannot demand that of your government. You can certainly demand that the government do its best to protect its citizens. As I said, that's what we have states for in the most basic sense. But you can never be 100% secure. And I doubt that we would want to live in a society that aimed to achieve that kind of perfection of security, because of all the costs and liberty and so on that would involve. So it's important to remember that we can try to not guarantee, but try to prevent 9/11s from happening. But there are absolutely no guarantees in this world, and we simply have to learn to live with a sense of vulnerability that I think Americans just did not feel before. Quite unlike people in the rest of the world. I mean, you go to Europe, and what do they remember? They remember ravaged cities and people fleeing them as refugees and so forth. The Brits still remember all the bombings of the Blitz and so forth. And we were protected. That didn't happen to us. Well, it has. And I think it's important that we recognize that this is simply the situation that we're in, and that we acknowledge that, and that it's reasonable to expect that our politicians tend to the issue of security. It is not reasonable to expect that it can be guaranteed perfectly.
Could I just add one thing? I think as frightening as it is to imagine anything like 9/11 again, I think it was a scarier world for the United States in the early 60s and 50s, the missile crisis particularly, and a scarier world for all of the Western world in 1941 and 1942. Nothing that Al-Qaeda has, as far as I can tell, remotely can approach the power of nuclear weapons or united Japan and Germany in 1941.
I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we still had even though we were pretty young, had that image in our mind of the mushroom cloud. I mean, it affected the whole Johnson-Goldwater election, after all. It was something that was extraordinary in its impact. Question specifically for you, Michael Nock. How did 9/11 change the American military?
Well, the military has changed dramatically since 9/11. I mentioned special operations. Special operations was always, I wouldn't say a backwater, but it was a secondary, tertiary capability of the military. When there was the failed Iranian hostage rescue crisis by Carter in '79, there was tremendous soul searching by the military. It was a catastrophic outcome, and that was only a few years after Vietnam. So they really went into a huge rethinking and produced a world-class capability now, which it's up to the president to decide when to use and when not to use. That was what was used to kill bin Laden. That's what's being used in Pakistan to hunt down Zawahiri, his successor. That's what's being used to kill other Al-Qaeda operatives in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and it's being used elsewhere. The other thing is, I can just as an anecdote, I worked in the Pentagon every day for about 14 months from spring of '09 to the end of the spring of '10. And I was at a level where they could bring me a lunch every day. And I said, I don't want to have lunch in my office every day. I want to go down to the cafeteria. I want to be online. I want to hear what the chit-chat is. Because, who's in the Pentagon? There are many civilians, but there are zillions of guys and ladies in uniform. And
forgive me, would you indulge my curiosity? What do they serve for lunch?
the food's not bad. They have a very good Chinese restaurant there. They've got McDonald's. They've got a lot of fast food places. It's not haute cuisine. It's not, Alice Waters wouldn't be pleased. But it was okay. But you should hear the discussions, This is my 4th tour in Afghanistan. I haven't seen my kids much in the last 6 years. I lost my arm. I mean, 99.9% of Americans are untouched by Afghanistan. When you're on that chow line every day, it's right in your face. And a tiny percentage of the American public, all volunteers, are bearing this burden every single day. And it's draining. And that's actually a reason, by the way, I can just tell you, on the Libyan decision, defense was the greatest opponent to American military involvement in Libya on the ground. Defense, not state. State was interested in American troops on the ground. The White House was interested in American troops on the ground. The uniformed military said, no, we are stretched so thin, and who knows what Libya will become once we're there, even though it's desert and it's smaller and what. So there's a fatigue among the American military. Also, of course, budgetarily, the Pentagon budget rose multiple times, multiple-fold. We now have a $700+ billion defense budget. It's larger than the next 24 nation defense budgets in the world. We used to be arguing who's spending more, the Russians or us. Now we spend more than the Russians, the Chinese, the French, the British, everybody combined. And it's led to exacerbation of our economic problems too. So it's really changed a lot. But having spent a little time with the military leadership, some of whom are now retiring, I can tell you they're very cautious people. They're very chastened by this. They're not flame-throwing guys. Often the interventionists are the civilians. Yes. Yeah. Not the military. The military are much more reserved and cautious because they're the ones who are going to have to fight. They're the ones who are going to have to die. These are senior flag rank officers. They're going to have to send guys into combat. No, half of them are not going to come back. So I would say they're very chastened by this whole 10-year experience.
I'd like to follow that up with a historical perspective from you, Jim Patterson, and that is, you remember during the Vietnam War, soldiers coming back and being maligned, and, I don't know how much the spitting on was really frequent. In fact, I think it was may have even been much more apocryphal than real. But there was certainly a lot of anger, particularly after the My Lai massacre, and yet now you have a non-conscripted military, you have a voluntary military, you have people sort of voicing this platitude about thank you for your service and everything. I mean, it's a good thing to say, but when you have an American public that isn't necessarily believing in the wars, after all, Vietnam was looked on as many as stopping a communist threat, then you have a whole different attitude from the citizenry toward the service, don't you?
I think you said it. I mean, what you're saying is for instance, I'm from Rhode Island, and they have a lot of troops going over there and coming back. And every time they land at the airport, it's front page story, and there's, people there with flowers and everything but brass bands, and there's all this gratitude for the sacrifices they've made. But as you say, these civilians may be grateful, but they don't feel a part of it.
Yeah.
They're not suffering. I mean, you mentioned Bush before. One thing he never asked any Americans to do was to sacrifice anything. And that's what a lot of people hold against him. And because we have a volunteer military, of course, nobody has to fight who doesn't want to.
Let me go to another question for you, Gene.
Sure.
Major media outlets are producing stories on 9/11 10-year anniversary. Should the people be reminded of the events again? What should the media be digging into in this special occasion? Talk about the role of the media.
Sure. Well, certainly the media should be paying attention. We, for reasons that I don't think I fully understand, probably a cultural anthropologist would, we like to have anniversaries and to mark decades and so forth, and to remember things that happened. So it's unsurprising that we're having this huge sort of media push to remember, to recall, to remind.
Let me just remind everybody, this will be broadcast Saturday on KQED, by the way.
And combined with
2:30, that's a plug, but
that's
it's also
right.
a fact.
Combined with some lamentation that there are many young people who were too young to really deal with these events at the time and who really have no living memory of them and should know more. I think there's, again, it's a delicate situation because how we remember things is very complicated. Memory is a complex process, especially cultural memory. Is it a story of collective victimization? Is it a story of collective heroism? Is it a story of resilience, which is one of the themes that's
the narrative keeps changing, doesn't it?
It moves around and touches on all of those poles. I think it's important not to descend into a kind of bathos where we kind of revel in repeating the story of loss. At the same time, it's terribly important to remember and to honor those who, not only those who died on that day, but those who do serve, going back to the military question.
And forgive me, also the iron workers, the firefighters. After 9/11, the police and the work that people in those professions did was just extraordinary.
It was
needs to be remembered.
It was absolutely extraordinary, and people were reminded in a way that they hadn't been before. Those firemen are ready to risk their lives to save me. The policemen the same. These are people that I never think about, and yet they're there and they're prepared to engage in these acts of self-sacrifice to save strangers. And that's something terribly important to remember. Any society that still creates people with that capacity to serve, I think, is a society that has something good going for it. And in that respect, it does seem to be problematic that the vast majority of us are so separated from people who serve in those capacities. I teach at an elite university at the University of Chicago, and I dare say that the overwhelming majority, I think it would be safe to say, 98% have never had contact with a fireman, a policeman, and have one in the family, or someone who serves in the military. Maybe it's not quite that high, but close. And I've noticed that it makes a distinct difference in my classes. I teach courses on war and ethics. If there is a military person in the class, that suddenly the issues are not just abstract issues that we can talk blithely about, but they're brought right down to the concrete level, and it makes a huge difference to have that kind of dialogue. So I do think we need to find ways to more fully integrate the military into the society more generally, and to be aware of what's going on. I'm not quite sure what the mechanisms would be, but I think it's important that we figure out how to do that.
Another historical anecdote.
Yes.
Rhode Island is the only state that still celebrates what used to be called VJ Day. Mm-hmm. It's now called Victory Day, and it's a holiday in the state of Rhode Island.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to extend my thanks to James T. Patterson, to Jean Bethke Alstein, to Michael Knock, to you, our audience, and leave you with one word on this occasion, and I think it's an important word for 9/11, for this particular notion that we have been stressing this evening, and that's remember. Thank you so much.
Nice to see you. Great fun.
Yeah, very good.